In the 2nd century BC, Judea lived under the constant pressure of Roman occupation, a period of great upheaval, mixing political, religious, and cultural factors. The presence of the Roman Empire, with its military power and its tax system, imposed severe restrictions on the autonomy of the region, especially with regard to local leaders. The Temple in Jerusalem, which was the center of the spiritual life of the Jews, also became the epicenter of conflict and the struggle for power. It was not only a sacred place, but also an institution of immense political and economic importance. Thousands of pilgrims regularly visited the temple, which attracted the attention of both religious leaders and Roman authorities. Religious leaders, especially those who held the office of high priests, had to balance their spiritual responsibility with the need to appease the Romans in order to preserve the political and social stability of the region. It is in this context that figures such as and Caipha rose to power, distinguishing themselves not only as religious leaders, but also as central figures in the political management and control of the temple, and in particular became an influential figure when she occupied the role of high priest. The Bible mentions her importance and influence particularly during crucial moments in the life of Jesus in Luke 32. The sacred text informs us that and Caipha exercised religious influence during the ministry of John the Baptist, thus showing the longevity and extent of their power, although the title of high priest changed frequently. Anna's authority remained strong even after he was officially replaced by his son-in-law Caiaphas. This continuity of religious power is largely due to the fact that the Canaan dynasty had established itself. Not only did he hold office on several occasions, but he also ensured that his sons and son-in-law had access to positions of great importance. Anna's influence over the temple in Jerusalem was such that she oversaw the daily rituals and sacrifices, ensuring that everything was carried out in accordance with Jewish religious law. In John 18 verse 13, we again see the authority of the donkey in action when Jesus is brought before it for the first time after his arrest. Although Caiaphas was the official high priest of the time, the position of Anna and her family in the priestly power reflected the complexity of relations between the Jews and the Romans. Anna, in order to ensure the continuity of her dynasty at the time, the temple not only protected the purity of the rituals, but also built a political bridge that ensured the survival of the Jewish people under Roman rule. Caiaphas, her son-in-law, would later play a decisive role in the trial of Jesus. Furthermore, Anna's position went beyond the religious sphere, for as high priest, she also exercised significant control over the finances of the temple in Jerusalem, including the currency exchange system, an essential service for pilgrims from far away who had to convert their currency to make offerings to the temple. Considerable profit for the religious leaders, which aroused suspicion and accusations of corruption surrounding the donkey. The Bible reports that Jesus, upon seeing the commerce in the temple, reacted energetically, chasing away the money changers and animal sellers, accusing them of turning the house of God into a den of robbers. Matthew 20 verse 11, 12 verse 13. Although Han is not directly mentioned in this episode, the control he exercised over their financial activities suggests that his influence was at the origin of these practices, partly explaining his opposition to Jesus. Caiaphas's marriage to the donkey's daughter secured a strategic alliance with one of the most powerful families in Judea. Caiaphas's appointment as high priest was not only a religious step, but also an assertion of power within the priestly elite that the Canaan dynasty had established. It ensured that he and his descendants controlled the high priesthood for several generations. The succession of the position between Hannah, her 5 sons, and now her son-in-law Caiaphas reflects the close connection between politics and religious power at the time. This dynasty was deeply intertwined in the religious and political affairs of Judea, maintaining an almost uninterrupted influence in the temple. Caiaphas, in addition to his inherited position, was known for his ability to manipulate the complex relations between the Jews and the Romans. His understanding of the political dynamics of the time gave him a privileged position where he knew how to balance the demands of Rome with the need to maintain religious order in the temple. His role during the trial of Jesus was decisive. In the Gospel of John, Caiaphas appears as the leader who openly suggests that Jesus should be sacrificed for the good of the people, saying that it is advantageous for a single man to die for the people and so that the entire nation does not perish. John 1150. His pragmatic vision led him to see Jesus as a threat to be eliminated, fearing that his growing popularity would provoke a revolt and bring the wrath of Rome upon the Jewish people. The religious context of these figures is also relevant. And Caipha belonged to a school of thought that rejected belief in the resurrection of the dead and the Last Judgment, which distinguished them from other Jewish sects of the time. Although the biblical text does not fully specify the sectarian affiliation of Donkey and Caipha, their beliefs reflected a more materialistic and political vision in their actions, thus aligning with the mentality of the Sadducees, a group that denied the resurrection and was more concerned with preserving their possessions and status. This doctrinal position certainly influenced their decision against Jesus, whose preaching about the resurrection and the kingdom of God directly threatened their views and authority as Jesus continued to perform miracles and gain disciples. Anna and Caiaphas saw their influence erode. Crowds impressed by their teachings and signs began to challenge the established leadership. The gospel accounts clearly show that fear of losing control of the people was a major factor behind the decision to arrest Jesus. In Mark 14 verses 1-2, we see that the religious leaders, including Caiaphas, were looking for a discreet way to arrest Jesus, fearing a riot during the Passover feast. In this context, Anna and Caiaphas became the main people responsible for the plot that led to Christ's death. The pressure to maintain order and avoid a revolt combined in the direct threat that Jesus posed to the religious and political power structure led its leaders to take drastic measures of Roman oppression. Coupled with internal tensions in Judea, they created a climate where the religious leadership, desperate to preserve their authority, considered that Jesus was not only as a heretic, but also as a real danger to the balance of power in the region. The Roman occupation, already tense in itself, made any popular movement likely to trigger revolts. The figure of Jesus, with his messages of hope and his miraculous signs, seemed capable of mobilizing the masses against the existing authorities. This fear of a revolt was not only a religious concern, but it also implied the threat of retaliation from Rome, which would not hesitate to use force to crush any movement likely to disturb the peace in this context. And Caiaphas developed a plan to neutralize Jesus before his influence became a concrete threat. He knew that a public arrest could provoke riots, especially at Passover time, when Jerusalem was full of pilgrims, so they opted for a discreet approach, using one of Jesus' disciples to facilitate the arrest. Judas Iscariot, driven by disappointment or greed, offered to betray Jesus in exchange for 30 pieces of silver. As narrated in Matthew 26:14-16, this act of betrayal gave Caiaphas and Anna the ideal opportunity to arrest Jesus in secret without causing a stir among the crowd. Jesus' arrest took place at night, a time carefully chosen to avoid an immediate uprising of the people. The Garden of Gethsemane, as recounted in Matthew 26:47-50, Jesus was approached by a group armed by the chief priests and religious leaders, and Judas, according to an agreed signal, betrayed him with a kiss. The plan of Caipha and Anna worked as planned. They captured Jesus in a secluded location, without the protection of the crowd that followed him, ensuring that the arrest took place without much commotion. After his arrest, Jesus was first brought before Anna, reflecting the continuing influence this former great high priest still wielded behind the scenes. John 18 verses 12-13. Anna questioned him about his teachings and his disciples, looking for a pretext to justify his arrest. So Jesus was sent to the Caipha, the acting high priest at the time, to appear before the Sanhedrin, the council of Jewish religious leaders. Caipha, who had already declared that it is advantageous that one man die for the people, so that the whole nation does not perish. John 11 verse 50 manipulated the trial to present Jesus' statements as a threat to public order and, by extension, the security of the Jewish nation under Roman rule. During the trial before the Sanhedrin, Caipha used false witnesses to accuse Jesus of blasphemy, claiming that he had claimed to be able to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. Mark 14 verses 57-59. When Caipha asked Jesus directly if he was the Christ, the Son of God, Jesus responded in the affirmative, and this was interpreted as a confession of blasphemy, a crime punishable by death according to Jewish law. Matthew 26:63-66. However, Judea being under Roman occupation, the Sanhedrin did not have the power to carry out a death sentence, so Jesus was taken before Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, to ratify the sentence before Pilate. The Caipha and other religious leaders insisted that Jesus be condemned to crucifixion, arguing that he claimed to be the king of the Jews and therefore posed a direct threat to the power of Rome. Luke 23:12. Caipha's clever strategy was revealed when he presented Jesus as a rebel against Rome, using Pilate's fear of an insurrection to secure Jesus' condemnation. Pilate, although hesitant at first, gave in to pressure from the religious authorities and the crowd, and eventually handed Jesus over to be crucified. Jesus' crucifixion was carried out on the charge of being the king of the Jews. John 19:19, a political charge intended to justify his execution to eyes of Rome. However, for Caiaphas and Anna, the main objective was to preserve their ruling lineage by ensuring that their position of authority was not threatened by the growing influence of Jesus. The crucifixion of Jesus was therefore a deeply political decision. Anna and Caiaphas, by manipulating the trial and using Pilate as their instrument, ensured the execution of Jesus in order to protect their own interests and maintain the order that guaranteed them power and privilege in the eyes of the priests. The death of Jesus was seen as a necessary solution to prevent his influence from leading to a revolt that could have brought about the Rome's wrath upon the Jewish nation. The crucifixion of Jesus became a turning point that not only symbolized the culmination of tensions between Jewish religious authorities and Romans, but also the debate between the old and the new. Caiaphas and Anna, a central figure in this process, played decisive roles not only in the execution of Jesus, but also in the repercussions of his death and resurrection after the crucifixion. The impact of the resurrection of Jesus narrated in the Gospels placed Caiaphas in a delicate situation. The resurrection was an event that shook the religious power structures of the time. For Caiaphas to admit that Jesus was resurrected was equivalent to recognizing that he was in fact the Messiah, which would have validated his words and actions, thus putting at risk all the authority that Caiaphas and his relatives held. In the Gospel of Matthew, we see that when the soldiers guarding the tomb came to report what they had seen, that Jesus had risen from the dead, Caiaphas and the other religious leaders bribed them to spread the false rumor that Jesus' body was stolen by his disciples. Matthew 28 verses 12 to 15. This episode reveals Caiaphas' categorical refusal to accept or recognize the event of the resurrection, a denial that was not only theological, but also political. The resurrection of Jesus was not only a miracle, but also a validation of his message. For Caiaphas, this recognition was unacceptable because it would have undermined the trial he had led against Jesus and weakened his authority as high priest. It was not simply a theological disagreement. Caiaphas' resistance was a desperate attempt to maintain control over the Jewish people and ensure that power remained in the hands of the priestly elite itself. After the crucifixion, Caiaphas continued to actively oppose the emerging movement of Christianity. As the communities of Jesus' followers grew, he faced a new challenge. The Book of Acts shows that Caiaphas played a major role in the persecutions against Christians. Stephen, one of the early martyrs of the church, was arrested and brought before the Sanhedrin on charges of blasphemy. During his trial, Stephen gave a powerful speech defending his faith in Jesus, which deeply angered the religious leaders. Caipha, for a priest, was probably present supporting the decision to stone Stephen to death. Acts 7:54-60. This episode illustrates the extent to which Caipha was determined to use his authority to suppress any threat that Christianity might pose to the cohesion of the Jewish leadership. Prominent figures such as Stephen. Caiaphas would also have authorized the arrest of several other disciples of Jesus, as described in Acts 4, when Peter and John, after healing a lame man, were brought before the Sanhedrin for questioning. Caiaphas, once again present, found himself confronted with the growing audacity of the apostles who continued to preach the resurrection of Jesus despite attempts at intimidation. Pierre firmly declared that it was necessary to obey God rather than men to act. 529. This direct confrontation symbolizes the growing resistance of the early Christians to the authority of Caiaphas and their refusal to give in to pressure from the Sanhedrin on his side. Anna also continued to exert her influence even after the crucifixion of Jesus as patriarch of a priestly dynasty. His authority remained even though he no longer officially held the office of high priest. He remained a prominent figure in the temple in Jerusalem, and his reputation for corruption coupled with his excessive religious practices made him a controversial figure. His continued authority after the death of Jesus reflects the resilience of the power structure he created around his family. Despite this resilience, Burrow's fate changed considerably over time. Historical records show that around 70 AD the place of revolt Jewish, also called the Great Revolt, although the Romans allowed some religious freedom to the Jews. Economic policies and the interference of Roman governors in local affairs fueled resentment, the increase in Roman taxes, and the corruption of procurators, such as the infamous Jesus Florus, exacerbated popularity. The discontent of the Jews, linked to their religious and cultural autonomy, no longer supported Roman interventions which they considered an offense to their traditions and their faith. When Florus looted the treasury of the temple in 66 AD, this was seen as sacrilege and sparked the conflict. The revolt broke out in Jerusalem, where the Jews initially managed to expel the Roman garrison and establish a provisional government. The Roman response was ruthless. General Vespasian was sent with his son Titus to suppress the rebellion. The Romans, thanks to their military superiority, attacked the main cities of Judea, and in 70 AD they laid siege to Jerusalem. The city suffered a long and brutal siege with famine, disease, and internal conflicts between different Jewish factions. When the Romans finally managed to break through the city's defenses, they looted and destroyed the temple. The destruction was total, and the consequences were devastating for the Jewish people, both spiritually and politically. Many Jews were killed, and thousands more were sold into slavery or scattered throughout the Roman Empire, marking the beginning of a diaspora that would last for centuries. The high priest Hannah was also killed amidst the chaos of the Jewish revolt. Flavius Joseph, a Jewish historian of the period, records that the Romans, in their campaign to suppress the revolt, killed many prominent figures, including Anna, as part of his strategy to dismantle the Jewish leadership. This violent end marked the end of Burrow's life, but his influence and the dynasty he founded were not forgotten. His involvement in the events leading to the RC's fiction of Jesus and his continued opposition to the Christian movement ensured that he would remain one of the most memorable figures in Judean religious history. In a puzzling mystery, decades after the events of the crucifixion, an archaeological discovery has revealed a family tomb south of Jerusalem. This tomb contained ornate bones, one of which bore the inscription Joseph, son of Caipha. This discovery caused quite a stir because it appeared to be the tomb of the high priest Caipha. Flavius Josephus, the famous Jewish historian of the time, mentioned Caipha in his writings, describing him as the high priest who contributed to the trial of Jesus. The inscription seemed to corroborate this information. The identification of the name Joseph, son of Caipha, is considered by many to be proof that this tomb is indeed that of the high priest. However, some scholars question the authenticity of the discovery, suggesting that the inscription may have been forged or that the tomb belonged to another family with the same name. The debate over the authenticity of Caipha's tomb continues to divide the academic community. Discussions concern the reliability of the inscriptions, the dating of the ossuaries, and the relationship between archaeological finds and historical accounts. Although the identification of the tomb remains a controversial issue, this discovery offers us a fascinating insight into the religious leaders of Jesus' time and the lasting impact they had on each other's history. On the other hand, the consequences for Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor who allowed the crucifixion of Jesus, were tragic and resulted in his downfall as an authority in Judea. Although he gave in to popular pressure to maintain political stability, his decision had profoundly negative repercussions on his career and, according to some accounts of his personal life, even after the crucifixion of Jesus, Pilate faced increasing difficulties in maintaining order in a region marked by constant religious and political tensions. He was already known for his brutality and for a series of repressive actions against the Jews, including the excessive use of force against those who opposed Roman policies. In one notable episode, Pilate mixed the blood of certain Galileans with his sacrifice, which provoked strong indignation. Luke 13:1. This type of violent and insensitive action only increased the popularity and discontent with his government. The increasing pressure and the inability to adequately deal with the revolts in the region culminated in his dismissal in 36 AD. Jesus Christ, he was recalled to Rome to answer the charges brought by the Samaritans after an incident in which his troops violently suppressed a religious assembly seen as a threat. Emperor Tiber died before Pilate could defend himself, making his position even more vulnerable. The Bible does not mention Pilate's final blow to fate, but there are several traditions and apocryphal stories about him. In the apocryphal text Mor Pilati of Tischendorf, Pilate is said to have committed suicide when he was recalled to Rome to face the consequences of his actions. According to this tradition, he preferred to end his life rather than suffer a more severe punishment. Another tradition found in the apocryphal text of Pilate mentions that Pilate was executed during the reign of Nero, several years after his fall from grace in 1961. A surprising archaeological discovery has shed new light on the figure of Pontius Pilate during excavations in Caesarea Maritima. A team of researchers, led by the physician Antonio Frova, found a fragment of limestone, a plaque measuring 82 centimeters wide and 68 centimeters high. This plaque bore an inscription in Latin that read Pontius Pilate, Prefect of Judea, dedicated to the people of Caesarea, a temple in honor of Tiber. The inscription confirms the historical presence of Pilate and his role as governor of Judea under the Emperor Tiber, offering a rare archaeological testimony that complements the biblical accounts of the Gospel of Luke. Pilate is identified as the Roman governor of Judea during the reign of Tiber Caesar, and this inscription confirms the correspondence between the biblical account and the historical record. This discovery not only highlights the existence of Pilate as a historical figure, but also highlights his active involvement in political and religious figures of the time. This archaeological discovery leads us to a deeper reflection on the figure of Pilate, whose actions during the trial of Jesus are the subject of a great moral and spiritual debate in the Gospel of Matthew. Jesus offers a reflection on light and darkness that constitutes a powerful metaphor for discernment and decision-making in Matthew 6 verses 22 to 23. Jesus declares that the lamp of the body is the eye. If your eye is in good condition, your whole body will be full of light, but if your eye is in bad condition, your whole body will be in darkness. Here, the metaphor of the eyes as a lamp of the body highlights the importance of clear perception and moral discernment. The light in this metaphor symbolizes truth, wisdom, and clarity, while darkness represents ignorance, confusion, and error. When Jesus speaks of good and bad eyes, he invites us to reflect on how our choices and our vision of the world shape our path. If our eyes are good, that is to say that if we have moral discernment and seek the truth, our actions will be illuminated by wisdom. However, if our eyes are bad, if our decisions are guided by moral blindness, we will be plunged into darkness. When we consider in Pontius Pilate's journey, we notice how his choices were shaped by the darkness of political pressure and moral indecision. Although Pilate was warned both by his conscience and by his own wife, who had a disturbing dream about Jesus. Matthew 27 verse 19, he gave into popular pressure and ordered Jesus' crucifixion, washing his hands in a gesture of false innocence. His choice of ignoring the truth and seeking political stability at all costs led him to a dark fate as governor. He allowed the darkness of his discernment to guide him, which resulted in his fall from power and an uncertain and tragic destiny. Caipha and Pilate's donkey journey leads us to deep reflections on the human condition, power, responsibility, and God's sovereign plan. These three characters, so central to the drama of Jesus' crucifixion, show how personal decisions, often motivated by ambition, fear, or indifference, can align with a greater plan that is invisible to human eyes but perfectly guided by divine hands. Although Caipha and Pilate can be followed down paths marked by moral errors and wrong choices, their stories reveal how even these failures can be part of God's redemptive designs, reminding us that nothing escapes the sovereign control of the Creator. In Kazan, we see a man who, behind the facade of religious power, sought to preserve his influence and control over the temple in Jerusalem. He symbolizes the struggle of many individuals who, in wanting to maintain their status and their wealth, loses sight of the very essence of what he will have to defend: justice, righteousness, and faith in God. His relentless pursuit of control reveals a spiritual blindness that is also common in our daily lives. How often, in the quest to protect what we consider essential, our work, our social position, our status, we are neglecting what really matters. Anna clung to earthly power, but forgot that true power is in the hands of God. He actively participated in the trial of Jesus, without realizing that he was in the presence of the Messiah in our lives. How often, in our desire to preserve our little security, we fail to discern the divine action around us. C in turn embodies political pragmatism. His decision to sacrifice Jesus for the good of the people shows how human rationality devoid of spiritual discernment can lead to devastating choices. He saw in Jesus a threat to his position and stability with the Romans, but failed to realize the truth that was before him. In our daily lives, we are often tempted to make quick decisions that seem to be the most logical or practical, without considering the moral or spiritual implications. It is easy for Caiaphas to favor convenience over in truth. However, the story of Caiaphas teaches us that even though our decisions may seem right in the short term, God has a broader vision, and what we perceive as a solution may in reality be part of a design that we do not yet understand. By condemning Jesus, Caiaphas unknowingly contributed to the accomplishment of the greatest work of redemption in the history of humanity. For Pontius Pilate, he represents indecision and moral weakness. He recognized the innocence of Jesus, but pressured by the crowd and fearing that he would lose his position, he chose to wash his hands and leave the fate of Jesus in the hands of the people. How many times in our lives have we found ourselves in similar situations? We know what is right. We feel the weight of the truth in our hearts, but we give in to the pressure of circumstances, the opinions of others, or our inner fears. Pilate washed his hands in self-justification, but as history shows, this attempt to avoid self-destruction did not exempt him from his responsibility in our daily lives. We often try to avoid difficult decisions in the hope that problems will resolve themselves. But Pilate's lesson is clear. Omission facing what is right also has consequences. God calls us to have the courage to do what is right even when it puts us in an uncomfortable or unpopular position. As we observe the end of the lives of these three men, we understand that despite their weakness, their lives and their choices were part of a greater plan. The crucifixion of Jesus that they helped orchestrate was not an event out of control, but the culmination of the divine plan of redemption that reminds us that regardless of our good or bad decisions, God has the power to direct everything toward the fulfillment of his plans. This does not exempt us from our moral responsibility, but it gives us confidence that even in our mistakes, God can work to accomplish a greater purpose. Well, in his infinite wisdom, he can transform even our darkest moments into opportunities for grace and renewal. The story of Anna, Caiaphas, and Pilate reminds us that regardless of how our lives unfold, we are always involved in something greater, something that is part of God's designs, and that God in his sovereignty never loses control of his perfect plan. If this story inspired you and made you reflect on your own life and how you respond to God's call, don't let this opportunity pass you by. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and continue learning more about these powerful stories from the Bible. After all, true wisdom lies in listening and learning to obey the voice of the Lord. Thank you for watching. God bless you, and see you soon.